Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our slow waddle through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book and author by author, and hopefully era by era. At least that has been true for this first bookcase. We've mostly been in the ancient world and are mostly moving towards and through the Renaissance. We had a couple of stumbles. I didn't make any videos yesterday, and before that we had the New Testament. But now we're back firmly to the Italian Renaissance. And the last time we talked about that period, we talked about The Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione. And I mentioned then that when it passed around in samizdat form and then when it was published, it was one of the most influential, one of the most, to use the odious 21st century word, impactful books that was ever to come out of the Italian Renaissance, but that it was curiously bookended because it's a lavishly detailed description of a profession that existed during the Renaissance but doesn't exist anymore. No one is a courtier in the way that Castiglione imagined courtiers to be. There are all sorts of other words for that, but it's not an actual open profession anymore, and it once was, and that's what that book was all about. And that book was an echo, a presentiment, a kind of version of a kind of book that was very popular at the time and went on to continue to be popular for a long time. It's not particularly so anymore. It's been replaced by 15-minute segments on TV. But that kind of book was a handbook for princes, where authors in various states of employment or otherwise would write a book about how princes should deport themselves, what they should value, what they should do, what they shouldn't do. Always with the idea, with the hope, these authors always with the hope that the book would come to the attention of either their own prince, which at the time almost everyone had one, or some prince, who would not only say, sit back and read this thing and say, that was very useful, but then pretty much immediately afterwards say, I bet that author would be worth paying. That almost never happened. Any part of that, most princes in the Italian Renaissance did not read, and the ones who did certainly didn't ever make job offers like that. Hope springs eternal, and these authors were always hoping for that kind of eventuality. Either that, or they had that kind of eventuality already and wanted to burnish their prince's reputation by writing a book of exemplary behavior that's sandwiched by declarations that their prince already exhibits it. One way or another, these handbooks for princes were tended to be heavy on the piety, heavy on the wish fulfillment, perfect behavior, at a time when that was everything. Depending on where you lived, depending on who you were, the total unpredictability of what you had for a prince could affect everything about your life, whether or not you or your sons were killed in battle, whether or not you had the right to trade freely in the marketplace, whether or not you could be outside after 8 at night, whether your town went to war precipitously and unpreparedly with a much stronger adversary and was laid waste, and you were dispossessed. Every aspect of your life could be affected by your prince in a way that in our mostly federated modern world most people don't experience that in anything like the immediacy that Machiavelli did, for instance, or that the ordinary people. Machiavelli was not an ordinary person. Castiglione was not an ordinary person, but ordinary people would experience that in a way that we don't really. A perfect example is what's happening in the United States today. The United States is a constitutional democracy, a federated democracy, which means that having a science-denying, egomaniacal maniac nincompoop in the top federal job as President of the United States and Congress assembled is blanketed. The ordinary citizen is blanketed from that power by the intermediary layers of power. We have a situation in the United States now where the virus is rampaging, and due to stubbornness on the part of the American people and also unpreparedness on the part of the federal government, that's only going to get worse before it gets better. And yet, you have a president of the United States saying, the subject kind of bores me. I want to get back to having my rallies even if people die. So I think we're over it. I'm seriously considering just ordering people to go back to work. But He isn't a prince. He can't actually do that. He can say it. He can say anything he wants, but he has no power to affect whether or not the governor of California, which has the economy of an independent country, opens up the state for business or relaxes quarantine procedures or anything like that. He has no power to affect that in California or Wisconsin or Iowa or Florida or especially, God forbid, New York. And that means that American readers, modern readers, and that's not just America, that's a lot of the world, will look at a book like the one we're going to do today, or Castiglione's book, and say, well, okay, that's not exactly right. But there are similarities, and of course, when I mentioned Castiglione's book, I mentioned that there was one other book from the Renaissance that was even more quintessential, even more signature, and far, far more influential on the whole world that came after it. And that's the book that we're dealing with today. This is, of course, The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. And Machiavelli's book is here. I'm showing you the version. This is the Penguin Classic hardcover. Lovely thing with a design by Coralie Bickford Smith that has the blue on the top, the darker shade on the bottom with these patterns. These are sewn bindings. They have a built-in bookmark. They're just lovely, just paperback size, but a hardcover. Just lovely. I wish I had a lot more of these things. The one thing I don't know about them takes time to learn, and I haven't had the time to learn it, which is whether or not this stuff comes off in use taking in and out of a bag. I haven't had to do that because I haven't had to use my bag. I haven't gone anywhere. But I don't. That's the one thing I don't know about these, is whether or not this is actually imprinted in the book or just sort of lightly laid on. But this is a Penguin Classic of Machiavelli's The Prince, but it is not. I believe that the Machiavelli, the Prince version that Penguin has always run, I believe the paperback was translated by our old friend George Bull, who we've seen translate so many works from the Italian Renaissance. I'm pretty sure that he did the standard translation for Penguin Classics. I looked, and I don't have a paperback of The Prince. Niccolo Machiavelli, I don't have a Penguin Classic of The Prince. I don't have a paperback of any kind of The Prince, even a Norton Critical Edition. And this is not by George Bull. This is by Tim Parks. And it's really, really good. The translation and the introduction are both by Tim Parks. And I'm going to read you a bit of his introduction and his translator's note to give you an idea of what a good companion he is in this whole thing. This is a book where Machiavelli, in bitter retirement and in lots of physical pain, he had reached the heights of Florentine power. He had a couple of offices. He'd been a long career diplomat at a time when that wasn't just a make-weight post, when that really mattered. And after that, he was had as high a position in the state as you could ask for without being the ruler of the state. He was just a step below. So he wasn't, when he writes about the functioning of the state, as he does in this book and also in his Discourses on Livy, which I love. Of course, I love the Discourses on Livy. I don't remember off the top of my head if Penguin Classics ever made a classic of Machiavelli's. What he would have said was his real work. I don't know if they ever did, but I don't have it. If I've ever had it, I don't have it anymore. I wish I did. But when he talks about the workings of the state, therefore, you know that he knows what he's talking about, because he had seen the workings of the Florentine state. And he'd also seen the turn of the wheel. He'd seen the kind of thing that can happen to you in Florentine politics, which is that he was rousted out of power, and on his way out, just for good measure, he was imprisoned and tortured with a kind of torture that is long-standing. It's not just that the soles of his feet were beaten. This was a particular kind of torture that had a name, and it had a skilled kind of practitioner who did very little else. And it was where the victim was stood in a room, hands bound behind his back, and then a loop of chain was linked to his bound hands, and he was slowly hoisted up, with his arms being pulled backwards, up and up and up and up and up, until, of course, the ligaments tore and the shoulders popped, and the arms were straight up, only backwards. And the victim would be raised until the pain was unbearable, but no physical damage had been done, and then lowered. and then raised again, and the pain would be much worse, and maybe it lasted a little longer, so there was a little damage, and then they were lowered, and then they were raised again. And that happened to Machiavelli. This person who had been, the finest clothes, the best office, all sorts of extramarital affairs, all sorts of perks of the job, traveling in the pomp of state, knowing the powerful knowing and meeting the powerful people of his day, that happened to him. That was the wheel of fate. That was the concept of the wheel of fate that people in the Renaissance clove to so closely, because they'd seen it happen. Because you could go from a height like that to being tortured, to screaming like a livestock animal, and then he was released. And he went to his country estate and never was involved in politics again. And I would be willing to bet, I don't know 100% for sure, but I'd be willing to bet that he could never raise his arms again. And probably only wrote or served himself meals with great pain. But the addiction of state power never left him. It never actually does leave anyone. No matter what Harry Truman or Dwight Eisenhower might have said, it never actually leaves anyone. And he wanted to curry favor. He wanted to curry favor with the new ruler, the new ruling junta in Florence. And that is marginally, maybe, sorta, kinda, the genesis of this book. This book is a handbook for princes, of course, you can tell from the title. But it's like no other handbook for princes that had ever been written, because it doesn't deal in pieties. It deals in ruthlessness. It deals in a very intentional subverting of what a pious reader would expect from that a counselor or ex-counselor would advise an all-powerful prince. It was clearly designed to reflect, Machiavelli clearly designed it to reflect the ruthlessness of what happened to him, and to reflect a worldview that dumps all the usual Christian precepts of how to behave off the side, so that you can get down to the business of ruling and staying in power, acquiring power and staying in power. And as a result of that, as a result of Machiavelli striking that tone, this book has been embraced and argued with and refuted a million times. That is the reason why it so totally eclipses the Book of the Courtier, is that this is on bookshelves in boardrooms today, everywhere in the world, and has been since it was written. This is, although I myself don't believe that Machiavelli actually wrote it to be such, I think this is a drastically misunderstood book. Whether or not he wrote it to be such or not, this has been embraced for centuries as not only a handbook of unprincipled leadership, but a benediction of unprincipled leadership. So that if somebody says, if you meet some dude bro with a $25,000 wristwatch and an empty apartment and a job that he works at 20 hours a day, and you ask him what his favorite book is, and he says The Prince by Machiavelli, you should run. You should just if he says it at a bus stop or at a restaurant or wherever, just turn on your heel without a response and run in the opposite direction, because he could kill you at any minute. He could kill anyone at any minute. I guess that's a reflection of the fact that I have met young men who said that, and it's always dangerous. They have not read the book, first of all. They've only read about it. And they think the main thing about it that they think is the main thing that so many people who have not read this book think about it, which is that it gives them sanction to be any kind of unprincipled a-hole that they want. I don't believe it does give that sanction. I think you have to read this very carefully as it was written. But I want to read you, whether you come to that conclusion or not, you really have to read this book. You should pick it up and read it. It's an afternoon's work to read. And I actually do recommend the Tim Parks translation. It's quite good, and I want to read you what he writes about translating just in general, since we've made such an interest in translating over the course of this March of the Penguins. Here's how he begins his translators. Now, I won't read the whole thing to you, but some of this is really good. Translations have a way of gathering dust. This isn't true in original text. When we read Chaucer or Shakespeare, we need a gloss, or in the case of Chaucer, a modern translation, but we only look at these things so we can then enjoy the work as it was first written. And we're struck by the immediacy and freshness, as if we had been able to learn a foreign language in a very short space of time with little effort and maximum reward. That is certainly true with learning how to read Chaucer. You will feel like you've learned a new language, and it will open up a wide gap between the very best Chaucer modernizers and modern translations and what's there on the page. And it's immediately accessible to you. It requires almost no work. to do. This is not the case with an old translation. If we read Pope's translation of Homer today, we read it because we want to read Pope, not Homer. Linguistically, the translation draws our attention more to the language and poetry of our 18th century than to Homer or ancient Greece. So to attempt a new translation of Machiavelli is not to dismiss the previous translations as poor. We are just acknowledging that these older versions are now draw attention to themselves as moments in the English language. Very nice way to put that. My efforts, of course, will someday meet the same fate. That's kind of neat. I kind of like that. But there's one other bit that I want to read you here, which is about the book itself. Let's see. I'm not sure that I can find it here. We can do without it if not. But his introduction goes on and on about the nature of the book and the history of the book. I used the built-in bookmark here to mark the translator's note, and as a result, I did not have another bookmark for the one other passage that I wanted to read. He goes on here about Savonarola. Here we go. Let's see here. I'll read you a little bit more of this because it's quite good. The scandalous nature of the prince was largely determined by its structure rather than any conscious desire to shock. I would actually agree with that. Originally entitled On Principalities, the book opens with an attempt to categorize different kinds of states and governments at different moments in their development, then moving back and forth between ancient and modern history to establish some universal principles relative to the business of taking and holding power in each kind of state. Given Machiavelli's experience, wide reading, and determined intellectual honesty, the project obliged him to explain that there were many occasions where winning and holding power was possible only if a leader was ready to act outside the moral code that applied to individuals. Public opinion was such, he explained, that once victory was achieved, nobody was going to put the winner on trial. Political leaders were above the law. Had Machiavelli insisted on deploring this unhappy state of affairs, had he dwelt on other criteria for judging a leader, aside from his mere ability to stay in power and build a strong state, had he told us, with appropriate piety, that power was hardly worth having if you had to sell your soul to get it, he could have headed off a great deal of criticism while still delivering the same information. But aside from one or two token regrets that the world is not a nicer place, Machiavelli does not do this. It wasn't his project. Rather, he takes it for granted that we already know that life, particularly political life, is routinely and sometimes unspeakably cruel, and that once established in a position of power, a ruler may have no choice but to kill or be killed. And Tim Parks notes throughout his introduction that concept of no choice, that I can't help it. I have no choice but to do how often that crops up in the book, that in the examples that Machiavelli brings up from ancient history and from history in his own time, where he will describe some horrible thing that a prince has done, and then say that the prince didn't have a choice. If you're like me, when you read this book, when you read those examples, you'll think, well, yeah, there are choices here. You had plenty of choices. You didn't have to do what you did. So, in other words, your penguin for today is still an argument starter, which is a rare thing. No one says that about Castiglione's book, and no one says that about Alberti's book, and no one says that about half the books that we've looked at. This thing still starts arguments. And the reason why is because the profession that it writes about is very much still with us. There are still rulers, whatever we call them, and whatever variation on absolute power they have, there are still rulers, and they still look for principles. There isn't an American president who hasn't been fascinated by this book. The ones who could read, anyway. So that's your penguin for today in this lovely hardcover, a lovely mass market sized hardcover. It is not George Bull, it is Tim Parks doing a translation for the Penguin hardcover classics. So we are now done with the what many people would call the high point of Renaissance writing, even though it's totally done without airs and graces. Machiavelli says it himself in this book and in letters. He says that I wrote it simply because I don't want anyone to concentrate on its style. I want them to concentrate on its message. This is an overwhelmingly influential thing to come out of the Italian Renaissance. But we have more Italian Renaissance books to look at, so this won't be the only one. We'll do a string of these this week, I would imagine. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, Book 2.